hemorrhage. So every severe headache had me heading down to radiology for a CT scan to make sure there was no brain hemorrhage. And then they were trying to give me transfusions of platelets, but they didn't work. Regular platelets didn't work. B-positive platelets did a little bit better. The Naval Hospital ran out of B-positive platelets, and they were trying to get some from Sentara. The ones from Sentara worked, and actually I got a bump. It did increase my platelet levels, but they would drop again. The Red Cross ran special tests to try to figure out exactly what kind of platelets would work for me with the antigens and things like that. There was only one unit of these specially matched platelets that they had tracked down at Sentara, and I heard the doctors talking about it, and I knew I was going to need a lot more than just one. I called Janice Hawkins and told her I needed her to get word out that I needed B-positive blood donors to come to the Naval Hospital to donate platelets. Brad put out a hospital-wide email, and by the next day, the blood bank phone was ringing off the hook. I think that day they booked every appointment they had for platelet donation 2 to 3 weeks out. The response was incredible. People I didn't know were donating platelets for me, and then they would see if they were specially matched. 4 people had the specially matched platelets, and several of them are in this congregation. And that's just amazing because evidently the special match, they weren't very optimistic that I was going to find a match. They weren't sure that just limiting the search to this area would be what I needed. After I got over the platelet issue and started having the platelets go up, that was one major crisis. I started to have high fevers. Each fever would be preceded by chills so intense my muscles would cramp and ache from the shivering. And then the fever would burn so hot that I felt like I couldn't move and that my skin was on fire. The doctors thought it was an infection, and they added IV antibiotics, antifungals, antivirals. I think my IV pole had so many bags, I don't know how the nurses kept track of it. They had to stagger them. They just gave me everything because they didn't know what kind of infection it was. They did find an infection in my Metaport, and that had to be taken out. But I needed 3 more units of platelets before my levels could even get up where the radiologist would agree to take it out. And I had to have another line placed in my neck. But the fever still continued. And it's just hard to explain to you just how dark those nights were and how endless the days. I couldn't sleep. As I told you, I couldn't read, couldn't listen to music, the TV. I was just basically there, just in my fevers, whether the chills or the burning. And all I had was my memory of verses that came to me, verses that reassured me of God's sovereignty, his faithfulness, and that Christ was my high priest interceding on my behalf, and that if I didn't know how to pray or didn't know what to pray for, Christ, the Holy Spirit, would intercede and would form the prayers that I couldn't say. And throughout that time, I learned what it was like to pray without ceasing and to just have an ongoing conversation with God, because other than the nurses, there wasn't anybody else there. And in the middle of the night at 2 a.m., that's who was there. Finally, one night, as the chills began again, I moved my big IV pole to the bathroom, and on the way back, I was having an out-loud conversation with Jesus. I just said, Lord, I can't do this anymore. Haven't I been refined enough? These refining fires of this trial are literally getting hot. I can't do this. How many days? I couldn't even remember how long it had lasted. And as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a touch on my left shoulder, and I turned and looked. I really thought somebody was behind me. And all of a sudden, I didn't have those chills anymore. Up until that point, I'd literally been shaking on my bathroom trip and back, and they stopped. And I didn't know what happened. I was like, I'm not sure. And I climbed into bed, and I kept looking at that spot. I had no more chills and shivers, and I was thinking, this is weird. I wasn't sure what happened. But then I realized the fevers would be gone. I didn't have to worry about that anymore. I just had a real peace that that challenge was over. There might be other things that came my way, but the fever part was gone. And sure enough, it was. I had one more fever that was much lower in temperature, almost normal, barely a fever, and then they ended. The doctors never really figured out, what infection it was or what antibiotic worked, but it was over. And 2 days later, they let me go home. Since then, I've completed a second course of chemo that was so much better. It went so much easier. I didn't have any side effects in my mouth. I was able to eat. The nausea was under control. And my platelets, I only needed 1 unit this time. They didn't, it responded and my bone marrow started producing. And 28 days, tomorrow starts round 3. And then 28 days after that, I start round 4. After that, I'll be on maintenance medications for 2 years. So I'm kind of halfway through the initial treatment. I can kind of see the end in sight. I'm not sure what maintenance really looks like, but I know that through each point, God's going to be with me. When Laura asked me to speak this morning, after she did, I reread all my Caring Bridge posts, and I was just humbled by all the prayers that were answered because I wrote them out. I ask you and everyone who is reading them to pray for me specifically of what I needed that day. And I can look back and see that prayer was answered the next day. That prayer was answered that night. It is truly humbling and overwhelming to just realize how good God is and how blessed I am. And just that throughout, I was able to have a peace. I wasn't fearful or scared or nervous. He took all of that away, and that's truly amazing. It's still amazing to me just how blessed I've been. As I conclude, I hope that my story will encourage those of you who are facing trials, whether physical, financial, or in a relationship. Regardless of what you are facing, He is faithful, and He is waiting to carry that burden for you and give you peace in exchange for the burden, in exchange for the fears and the worry. And His peace is not of this world, but of the next, and it will sustain you.